So, business statistics, what is it really about? The sort of simple way that I think about it is really a fundamental problem. If you try something, it doesn't mean that you're going to get the same result the second time that you actually try it. That's all it really means. So, in a very concrete world, right? So, we sort of assume that the world is concrete and we assume that everything that we do sort of equates to some certain action at the end of it or equates to some sort of outcome. There's really no statistics that are involved, and you don't need to think about this in any sort of way. You just perform this particular action and you get an outcome from it, that you sort of did this thing and you get the expected outcome from it. But in a world that is probabilistic, right? A world that sort of has some variance in it. So what is that? Just like weird stuff happens, right? Like one day you might show up and there's a hurricane. It's Hurricane Ian's going on right now in the state of Florida. It could be anything that happens, right? You show up, you go to work one day, but then there's a car accident. So you show up later, and that sort of determines, it makes you decide to go in a different direction than what you would have thought. There's all sorts of what's quote unquote randomness, things that just don't necessarily, you can't put your finger on what that particular thing is and what's causing it. There's kind of outside forces, exogenous, what's called exogenous, outside. That's all exogenous means. Outside forces that are happening. And you can't predict what those particular things are. So when you try that thing today, right, you don't necessarily get the same outcome that you're going to get in the following day. And this is, I mean, I love this. If I look around in almost every YouTube channel, almost every sort of post that's on the internet about business and, stocks or whatever, completely misses this. And people that have been trained for a long time understand that you can't possibly predict what's going to happen in the future very well, right? There's always something that's going to happen that's going to sort of dictate what the outcome that you're going to get. So what can you do about this, right? So what do we do as, scientists and as researchers? This is what we do. We simply get as many observations, quote unquote observations, of the same phenomenon or similar phenomenon. So we get a sort of a measure of how often that this thing is actually going to occur when you choose this particular thing. Turns out, when you do this in most of the business realm, and whether it's management or whether you're looking at stocks or whatever, it's not very good in terms of how often something is going to happen in a certain way, right? There's generally a lot of stuff, randomness in this world, and so it's hard to predict what's going to happen, right? And all of statistics, all of business statistics, all of the sort of field of statistics, it sort of suggests or is wants you to sort of believe that there is a central sort of tendency that happens. Now, that's not always true, right? Like there's a lot of phenomenon where there isn't something that happens repeatedly over time. In fact, a lot of phenomenon in business that happens like that. That you can't sort of get the same thing over and over and over again. However, if you find something that is called independent, right? So you can draw from different scenarios, right? So you want to look at housing prices. This is like a, typical thing. And you want to look at housing prices. Well, then you draw from different locations around the country or maybe around the world. And if you draw from different locations, as long as they're not happening together, which is not necessarily true, as long as they sort of are not connected in some sort of way. It's not true in the given world, but for the most part, in any given point, we could sort of assume that, right? As long as we do that, we should arrive upon some average housing price that exists in this world, right? Or maybe you're a manager right now and you're thinking of, how many times if I put out, so for example, I put out this advertisement, right? What are the chances of somebody actually clicking on this advertisement? Well, then you have to get many different, present this in front of many different people, and then you see how many times that they're actually going to click on this advertisement. or react to this particular advertisement, right? You can't necessarily draw from a sample of one. And I think that's the important thing to remember. Now, we do as human beings, we do that all the time. That's like a natural way of learning, right? Like we only have us to learn from and maybe a couple of friends that are sort of nearby. And there's all sorts of really interesting inference problems that come from that. But for the most part, the whole world, you can get if you sort of collect a large number of something happening, you can get some central tendency for some things to happen, right? And that's the important thing to remember with business statistics is that what we're trying to do is get an idea of how often this thing is going to happen, right? And that's really it. It's a really simple thing, right? So you count some predicted thing that you would like to happen, right? And then you sort of gather the number of sort of observations of this thing that you expect it to happen. And then you just get this nice little number that suggests what the probability is by taking the number of times that you're expecting this thing to happen or the number of times that it did happen, sorry. And then you divide by the number of sort of observations that you have. And you get this nice number of what is the probability, what is the likelihood of this thing happening in sort of independent draws in the world. And I think that's the important thing to think about is that you don't have, I got itchy nose, you don't have the possibility, you assume that in any given day, the same thing does not happen every day, right? And that's okay. We assume that as human beings that, that's not going to happen. The same thing's not going to happen every single day. And so we need to have some numbers that are associated with it, right? So that probability of this happening is what we're looking for. Now, another important number is sometimes we have magnitudes or values that are associated with it. So for example, coming back to the sort of business advertising example. So they click on an advertisement, go to an advertisement, but then they make a $10,000 purchase. Well, we want to understand how many times do they make that $10,000 purchase, or how many times that they make a $5,000 purchase. Well, then you add all those up and you divide by the number of times that they actually click this particular thing and actually purchase something, and you get what is called the expected mean. And those two numbers, the probability that something is going to happen and the expected mean of that particular thing, or what is the actual value of this thing happening, are really two incredibly important parts of all statistics, but especially business statistics. And that's what we're looking for is, what is the chance of this happening? Remember, in the real world, the chance of something happening is actually typically pretty low because there's lots of randomness and weird things that happen, right? And then the other thing is, what is the magnitude, expected magnitude of this particular thing happening? And, or what is the average sort of magnitude of this thing happening? And that's your mean, right? And those two things, or that's your average, those two values sort of give you a sense of what is the expected value of this thing going to happen, that this thing is going to happen? What is the chance of it's going to happen? And then how much is it actually going to happen? The expected value is simply just a multiplication of those two numbers. And it's an interesting phenomenon because almost everybody, if I sort of tell you this intuition, it sort of makes sense, right? Like you would expect something not to happen repeatedly. But most of us sort of go on this belief that if we follow this strategy, this hack, this system, that's going to happen all the time. But if you look at your sort of real life scenario, you're like, oh yeah, it doesn't happen all the time. And sometimes I get like this really good thing that happens because of it. And sometimes I don't. And that's what we're expecting with this. So hopefully this explains a little bit of business statistics. I want to sort of give you a little bit of explanation behind them, but I don't want to go too far into it at this moment. So if you have questions, let me know. Happy to answer it. All right, take care. Bye.